There we go. We're live.
You gotta make a YouTube face.
Deer in the headlights.
Yeah. I'm so surprised. Okay.
Yeah. All right. So after several attempts at technology, Luke and I finally got to go live here, and we were talking about this. There's an excerpt in this book. Whoops! In this book, written by Soloviev. It's actually from. Let me read the title. It's from Sophia, First Triad, First Principles, First Dialogue, the Absolute Principle as Unity, the Principle of Monism. And so as I read through this particular section that I'm going to read again out loud for the viewers, I was thinking of Luke the whole time. And so I thought, well, he needs to translate Soloviev for me a little bit. Let me find where I want to start. Let me see here. I don't know why I always feel so nervous when I'm on YouTube.
I don't even think about it.
I'm like, I gotta go. I gotta keep going. Okay. I can't actually tell you what they talked about previously because I don't remember at the moment, but I'm going to start here. So it's a dialogue between philosopher and Sophia, philosopher being Soloviev. So I'm going to just read it as it stands. Philosopher, my reason stops me here and asks if, in order to know the natural or essential relationship of the absolute principle to phenomena, we must not first know its nature or its proper essence. But you have said that the latter knowledge is impossible. Sophia, you confuse direct knowledge of the absolute principle in its proper or inner state with general knowledge of the idea that we have of it. You can see that we can have a general notion of the absolute principle without having direct knowledge of it by analyzing what we call a general notion. Philosopher, that is the definition or designation of a thing. Sophia, but how can you designate a thing if not by its relationship to another, that is to say, negatively? Philosopher, yes, I remember the great Spinoza's aphorism, every definition is a negation. Sophia, thus all general notions are negative and do not suppose direct and subjective knowledge. Okay, so I'm going to stop here for a minute because maybe it's good to just hit these things as they come along because these are my questions. So I've heard you and Cal and Nate and others talking about this negation, right? And it's hard for me to think about it as a thing when it's a no thing. If you get my drift.
Yeah. So maybe the way that I would think about it is that I mean, this is so like relational ontology, right? You only ever know anything in relation to other stuff. It's kind of like a point. Like a single point is nothing. Like if it weren't, you couldn't even or like the idea of a monad. Like this is what they're talking about. Like a point. You wouldn't even know it was a point unless it was on a page. So you understand the point in light of, in the context, in relationship to the page.
Okay, so so then in this case, I don't know how else to put it. Like, so what's more important then, the context or the point, or both equally important? This is maybe a dumb question, but it's just how my mind works.
No, I think that's I think both are important because you need both.
Okay.
But I think in our current, I would say in our current mode of consciousness and like what I call the egoic intellect, or like in Ian McGilchrist's terms, we have this hyper left-brained focus on the point or on the proposition. This is kind of what the postmodernism debate is about, but we have lost the context. And so I would say like ancient mystical traditions and mysticism by its nature, and for example, like orthodoxy. This is why I was so drawn to orthodoxy. Orthodoxy is fundamentally apophatic. So what that's saying is like it starts with the negative. It starts with what you don't know as
Right.
primary.
Okay, so
Um,
let
yeah.
you're explaining this to, your youngest daughter, okay? Just think of it in these
Mm-hmm.
terms.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Because I don't have this kind of mind, right, to think about it like this.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're thinking about something apophatically, what are you thinking about? Are you thinking about the point or the context or the space around them? Like, what are you thinking about if you're thinking about something apophatically? Because to me, you can't think about what's not there, right?
Yeah.
And what is there is the point and the context. So what's not there? That's,
Right. So describing, yeah, this is why it's hard. You often say, right, the feminine is uh implicit and hidden, veiled, right? I
yeah.
mean, this is something that you know intuitively, but the feminine is the feminine is the space, it's the matrix, it's the context by, I think broadly. And so
Would it here's a thought just came to me. Would it be the thing that's not there? Would it be the relationship between the point and the context?
yeah, it's implied. It's never explicit.
Right.
And it's hard to make it explicit. Like that's what we're talking about.
Okay.
We're trying
Okay.
to make this thing explicit, which by nature isn't. So like Peter Rollins illustrated it really well in some podcast recently where he said to just use the simple example of saying something like, words can't describe how much I love you.
Mhm, mhm.
Well, what's going on in that
Well,
sentence?
that's that you're trying to pinpoint, right? What the dynamic of that love is, but that dynamic only happens within that particular relationship.
For sure. And by not saying something, you're
Yeah.
saying words can't describe this. You are saying something.
Right, right, right.
Through the negative, you're saying something that's
Yeah,
beyond
yeah,
what any explicit thing could say. But it is explicit. So it's
yeah.
both.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Okay.
And I think the problem is that I often oh oh shoot. So there's something on the tip of my mind that just came up recently. Um So I was talking this morning to someone. There's a quote from uh, some. Um, it's a really really ancient quote from some Chinese samurai or something. But I first heard it through Joe Rogan, and I can't remember who it was. But it's once you know the way broadly, you'll see it in everything.
Oh, you had that. Yeah, that's that. You actually put it here. I'll find the name of the guy because you put it in
Mm.
here this morning. Um, whoops. That is. Where is it?
But it also what I'm trying to get at and keep looking for it is that
Yeah.
there's like a it's kind of what I'm trying to talk about when I talk about mosaic vision. There's a way of seeing what even like Rob Bell would call the thing behind the thing behind the thing that is that is this underlying unity or reality that is almost that it's too it's too big to ever bring down in a way that is fully encompassing, but it's present in everything. That like once you see that, you will see it everywhere. It'll be present in every finitude, in every particularity. You'll see it all over. And the problem is, this is the problem with the modern consciousness, there's no way to explain it to people. I can't explain it to you. Like, this is why I love that George MacDonald Lilith quote so much. It's like, I'm sorry I
Mm,
can't explain the
mm,
thing to
mm,
you. I but
mm.
barely apprehend it myself.
Right.
And the
Yeah.
fact is, no man understands anything. When he understands that, that's the first step towards understanding. That's like
Okay.
the great unknowing.
So the way I think about this is the concept of negative space in art.
Yeah.
So,
Yes.
when you start to fill in the negative space, the actual thing emerges out of it. And
Yes.
that's how I like for example, the journey that I've had in within creation itself, like living on a farm and you know God emerges out of creation in that way, right? So creation fills up that negative space, and out of it emerges the face of God, if that makes any sense to you. But that's
It
how.
does, but so you relate that to being on a farm.
Mhm.
What's the concrete way that being on a farm has shown that to you?
Well, because there's a lot of, well, it's totally relational for one thing. Like you have a relationship to the animals, you have a relationship to the weather, you have a relationship to the soil, and all of that is unseen. You
Mm,
can't describe it, right? Um, and so, but you know things because of it, because of the relationship. So you know, like when the wind is blowing in a certain way and there's a smell in the air, it's going to snow. I mean that's an obvious thing, but there are lots of those things, right? That you just have a knowledge of something without any explicit, how would I put that? Like instruction or propositions. It's not
mm,
like there's not a banner in the sky that says, the barometer is dropping right now. And,
yeah,
so
yeah, yeah.
you have this relationship, and then you also see within it the relationships that are made with seemingly disparate things, like, that if you find strawberries growing, you're going to find blueberries not too far away.
Hmm.
So there's a relationship there that just proves itself over time, but you don't know the details of that relationship. You don't know why that is, right?
The mechanism, the searching for the why, yeah, the
Yeah,
science.
yeah. And so you just go, what's most important to you is finding blueberries. So you look for strawberries first because they're easier to see because they're red,
Mm,
and the blueberries hide
hmm,
under the leaves, right? So just
hmm,
things like that, and then it's practical, but at the same time it's a mystical because you're relying on these unseen, spoken relationships that are happening all around you. Like, um, if you see an animal standing apart from the herd, for example, or the
mhm,
flock, and it's lambing time, well, then you got to get up there because she's probably going to have a baby, right?
mhm,
If it's not lambing time, then it's she's sick or injured,
mm,
you know.
mhm.
And if none of those are true, then you don't know what's wrong with her. You're just like, what are you doing standing here by yourself? You freaked me out, right? And so you have this real thing going on, but it's all unspoken.
Mhm.
Nobody's
Yeah,
texting you. Nobody's texting you, right? And saying, "Can you get up here? I'm about to have a baby."
yeah,
It depends. It relies on your attention for one thing, so it sharpens that, right? Like you end up
mhm.
having your attention sharpened by it. But anyway, we're kind of getting off track. So, and these things teach you things too. I'm trying to think of a concrete example to give you about God. Um,
Mm.
maybe something will come to my mind. Um, but anyway, yeah.
No, so I'm trying to tie it back into your reading too.
Well, we're off
So
track. We're off track. But let me let me go on with this reading now. Okay,
okay.
so I just needed to understand this: the negation, the no thing as a thing, right? As an actual thing. And so now, just to recap, I'm understanding it as the negative space, which is the actual dynamic of the relationship that is unseen. Like you can't see it, you can't grasp it, you can't describe it, right? This is why I love you so much. I have no words, right?
Mhm.
Something like that. Okay. Um, So Sophia said, thus all general notions are negative and do not suppose direct and subjective knowledge. And the philosopher says, and then what is the general notion of the absolute principle? Sophia, if the general notion of a particular being designates it negatively in relationship to another particular being, It is clear that the general notion of the absolute principle must designate it in relationship to all being, because all that we call being is its manifestation. Thus, we must say that the absolute principle is not being, that is to say, that it can be neither the direct object of our outer sensations nor the direct subject of our inner consciousness, for everything in these two categories is what we call being. You can see that it is not being from another angle as well. It is the principle of all being. If it were being itself, it would be a being outside of all being, which is absurd. Thus, it is clear that the principle of being cannot be designated as being. And then the philosopher says, so should I designate it as non-being?
Mm.
And Sophia says, you could surely do that. And in so doing, you would merely follow the lead of many great theologians, including Orthodox theologians, who have no compunction against calling God non-being.
Mm-hmm.
But in order not to confuse lesser minds like mine, it would be better to resist. The common person always understands non-being as the lack or privation of being.
Mm-hmm.
And it is clear that in this sense, non-being cannot become the predicate of the absolute principle. We saw that in manifesting itself, that is to say, in passing into being, in realizing itself, it does not cease to remain itself. It does not lose itself. It is not exhausted by the manifestation. Otherwise, if the principle of action would cease, action would also cease. Okay, so there's a ton of stuff in there.
Yeah, and this is what I just things like that are what I thought of as you were reading it is a lot of what he's talking about in this dialogue is this is Nate and I's debate that we've had ongoing numerous times about is God beyond being or not.
Right.
I mean, it's that very thing is because I was emphasizing that essentially what the philosopher, well, was it the philosopher that said, or Soloviev, that God, you could go in that tradition for to say that God is non-being essentially or beyond being, which a lot of great theologians have done,
Well,
and that's kind of
they do get into that idea of beyond being after this, Luke, but
well, that's the non-theism thing, you know, that Vervaeke will talk about,
beyond being.
because yeah, is to equate God with nothing essentially. Like you can do that, that's fine. That's just to
Yeah.
say like God in and of himself. And I see this within a Trinitarian framework, like God the Father in and of himself. But even the Father, see that? Like that's implying, see God, like if you just said God
Mhm.
in a very monistic way, like Sam Adams, or this is why I don't understand certain aspects of like when I have debates with certain Jewish people, I think Kabbalah's got a lot more depth of stuff. So if we're talking to like Yosef or Chezi or something, it's a lot more relational. But like if you're talking to like a very strict Unitarian monist that just says God, well, God in and of himself is like a point. It's nothing.
Right.
There's no relationship. There's no being in a monad. And so you could say classically within like a monarchical Trinitarian framework, and sorry this is abstract too, but like God in and of himself, I've said before, doesn't exist. But you can only do that as a thought experiment because God in and of himself never was, technically.
See, this is the stuff that really confuses me because I'm one of those lesser minds.
Well, and I don't think, and what's all of this stuff is like, I think it's not even a lesser mind. It's just like a certain way of thinking about it because I relate to you. Like there are people who I think talk about these things better than me. Like for example, this book is speaking about it better than I do, I think. Cal like is obsessed with this kind of thinking and
Yeah.
speaks about it very well. But this is why I talk about my radical personalism so much. Is like I don't think you ever understand this through its explanation
No, you don't.
because that's missing the whole point.
No, because okay, so like to me, the way that I understand hypostasis in a very simplistic manner is glue, right? And so you have this you have this mind and this body because you need to glue these things to these things have to become hypostatic to your experience. Like what we're talking about here, this idea of being and non-being and beyond being and all that stuff. You can only talk about it properly when it has fused itself to your own experience, and that experience comes through your body, right? This is why I'm so fascinated with the body, right? Because it's like this sensory apparatus that's feeling the whole world and putting together this pattern of reality for the mind, because the mind can do all that abstraction, right? It can go way out there into outer space. It's like Harding's headlessness, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's infinite.
Mm-hmm.
But the body will always bring you back to the earth,
Yeah.
right? And so, and there's a necessity in that, because, and this is how I make connections. The reason that I know that there's a necessity for that is that there is a Theotokos, right? And the Theotokos tethers us to the earth. This is the for me, this is the reason that it was so important to the early church to establish the divine and the human natures of Christ as being so important, like that you couldn't confuse that, because you can't throw yourself into infinity with your mind and forget about the body, otherwise you become Gnostic, right?
Mm-hmm.
And those are the tendencies when that happens. Like immediately you go into all these Gnostic tendencies. So you have to be tethered to the earth, and you have to see the body as a sacrament. And what's so interesting is that, and I mean, Jesus's body is a sacrament, okay? Right?
Yeah.
And so what's so interesting is that they end up, Soloviev and Sophia end up talking about matter and spirit, right?
Mm.
In this dialogue, because if you take your little thought experiment down the road, all the way down the road, you end up either having to decide whether you're going to be Gnostic or not. What, you want to hierarchically establish what's more important, my body or my mind, right? But and this is again getting off track a little bit, but this is to me why we need them both, because we need a hypostasis, and that only happens with the cooperation of both the body and the mind, right?
Yeah.
And
Well,
that's why Jesus has to be both human and divine.
Yeah. Well, you need you need both, because there's not it's almost like I'm trying to think of how to say it. The mind in and of itself, your body, your material body, your physical body is part of it's part of your larger person, your being, your soul. I mean, you need both. They're like it's like the pole of I've said that in relational ontology. It's like everything is a field, which is why I like Rupert Sheldrake so much. So there's these poles that aren't even necessarily opposites. They're just the two things in a relationship,
Yeah.
and so like an electromagnetic field, a battery, positive, negative, and that makes a thing. There's a resonance between it, but that's almost like your mind and your body, and there's a resonance behind it.
Yes.
There's a
Yeah.
spirit between it, but like that's who you are. That is the hypostasis. That is the heaven and the earth,
Right.
which is, and you need both of those things. So it's not like um that's
Okay.
why a
For
lot
me,
of
yeah.
yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, okay, so I use the term hypostasis, but I'm actually thinking about theosis.
Okay.
But theosis is a hypostasis, right? It's a hypostatic union, theosis, between the divine and the human.
Being in perfect harmony. Yeah,
Right.
when the body has submitted everything to God
Right.
in a way that has aligned with it, then
Yes.
those two poles resonate perfectly.
Right.
And and I would say that that's essentially what being a saint is or theosis or whatever is like those two things are perfectly lined up. It's kind of not a
Well, that is how Maximus describes the natural will, right? And the reason he makes the point that Jesus doesn't have a gnomic will, doesn't deliberate.
yeah, it's the either or. It's kind of like even this question. I don't that came up too. I don't know if it's in this talk, but I was speaking about it recently, and I can't remember the other source where it came up from. But it's something where there's a place that you get where a lot of these questions just become irrelevant to you. Like the mind body question is like, which is more important, like the mind or the body? And I'm just like, yes. You know, it's not a it's the kind of it's the to me that's the piece that passes understanding.
Yeah, but
Because when you're in that gnomic mode, you're deliberating between these things and there is no
right,
deliberation.
right,
Like it's,
right.
you know.
Yeah, yeah. Um, yeah. Okay. Let me just there was a question I had here. Okay, so I just want to know if I'm understanding him properly. He says
Okay.
that or Sophia, not him, but she. Thus, we
Mhm.
must say that the absolute principle is not being, that is to say, that it can be neither the direct object of our outer sensation nor the direct subject of our inner consciousness. So that's mind body right there. Okay. For everything in these two categories is what we call being. You can see that it is not being from another angle as well. It is the principle of all being. If it were being itself, it would be a being outside of all being, which is absurd. Thus, it is clear that the principle of being cannot be designated as being. So, is this, in simple English, God everywhere present, filling all things?
Yeah, I would say so.
Okay.
It's the kind of this is why I've always liked the understanding of panentheism because it's not a because pantheism relates the two in an equivalence, and it's not the two. It's not being in and of itself. It can't
Mhm.
be.
Yeah.
And it's not this thing that is completely outside and distinct from being, but it is the you know, it's very Hegelian, or it's the thing that Maximus would talk about. It's the identity of identity and non-identity. So it's present in it. Or like there's an old mystical saying that's what that I heard on Seekers of Unity that Zevi guy talked about once, where it's a very old thing, but it's like God is the circle whose like circumference is nowhere and center is everywhere. So it's like you can never reduce it to anything, but it's present in everything.
So
But it's not the same thing.
this is the description that Rilke gives when he says that your world becomes so vast that you can never step outside of it.
Yeah,
Okay. Okay,
I
I
think
understand
so.
that language.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay,
Yes,
so here, Kezi says apotheosis. What is that? I don't know what apotheosis is. Do you?
I don't either.
Okay,
I'm trying to.
Kezi, can you give us a definition if you're still there?
We're
All
just
right, so
radical. We're radical intuitors here, Hezzy. We're not like
totally.
we're autodidacts. We have
We're
no
like two
education.
blind people just feeling things out. We're like,
Uh, that's what I had a friend. I had a friend once because I go to this book club with all these highly educated people, and I have a bachelor's degree, and I'm just like I'm not highly educated. And then one of my friends has said, yeah, Luke's an autodidact. He's just figured all this stuff out. And we were around someone's wife, and I'm just like I think so. I'm not quite sure what that means, but I was kidding. I know what it means. Okay.
okay, so let's move on here into this like just superficial conversation that Solovyev's having with Sophia.
Okay.
Not. Okay, so then philosopher. But how can you define this non-being, which is nonetheless not privation or the lack of being? Sophie, if you call privation or lack powerlessness, then the opposite would be power or positive possibility or force. Thus, the absolute principle, being not as such being, man, this is starting to sound like Heidegger here,
It's
is the
complex.
possibility of being. That which is evident because it manifests itself, that is to say, the product of being. So is that potential?
I think so. Yeah, but so like my understanding of that is, so God gets beyond God, and I think us as icons of God and everything as icons of God you get beyond this duality of potency and act. So like I don't know if you remember that which is why Aquinas I think said God is essentially pure act, which what he meant was is it's
It's
the potent act. You know, it's the because that's the act, that's the body, right? Potency is the mind,
yeah,
and the action is the body, and so
right,
you have to have both.
right.
But there's this non-identical relationship
Okay,
between those
so
two
pure
things.
act. Okay, here's what I'm thinking. This
Okay.
is what I'm intuiting.
Okay.
Pure act is the natural will because
Yes.
there's no
Yes.
deliberation.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah,
Which I think really confuses people, which is why I hate libertarian free will. When people talk about free will, they bring in libertarian free will, but
right,
libertarian free will is gnomic.
right.
It's a deliberation between two things. And I'm like, no, that's
Yeah,
not what freedom is.
right.
That's slavery to like analysis paralysis. You know,
Well,
that's hell.
Schomburg talks about freedom as being true freedom being spiritual freedom, and I would say that this is exactly what natural will is
Yes.
allowing for, right? That kind of true freedom where you don't imagine and it's not a certainty either because you haven't deliberated to the point of certainty, right? But
Certainty isn't even an issue in natural
no,
will terms for me. Yeah.
like imagine it's like this is how I imagine natural will. It's like a bird falling out of the nest and spreading its wings and flying to safety. That's true freedom, right? It doesn't have to think about anything. It just
Yeah.
it just becomes what it is.
Yes. And this is why I've always loved the space trilogy and talked about the space trilogy forever.
Yes.
Because Paralandra and the Green Lady, when she and this is why I think that particular novel is so powerful. Well, and I love that Hades Strength too. People sleep on it, but specifically with the Green Lady and Paralandra, when she is because what's happening throughout that novel is the maturation and growth of an unfallen consciousness into its own freedom, but without ever falling into this divided deliberation, divided what I call divided man. She
Yeah.
never went there, but she teetered on the edge.
Right. Right.
Because when she was the perfect way that I love to illustrate is when she first meets Ransom coming at her on the waves on the island, she imagines it's the king because she's been separated from the king.
Yeah.
And then he gets close enough where she's just like, "Oh, it's not the king." But and then Ransom gets there and he starts talking to her and she's perfectly happy and content and she explains this all to him and he's just like, "Well, what weren't you disappointed when it wasn't the king?" And she's just confused because she says, "Disappointed? What do you mean?"
Right. What is that?
Right. And she's basically never had this experience of what she calls living in the expectant good rather than the real good that
Okay, so
Melodiel,
you know
God, brought to her.
what's really interesting about that example is that she thinks something, right? But doesn't have an expectation.
Yes, she doesn't live in the expectant good. She doesn't even know how. The
And
non-reality.
and then she's wrong, right? Because it isn't the
Yes.
king.
Yes.
But how can you be wrong? Like this is
She's right, but wrong.
how can you be wrong when you have no expectation? Like,
Right.
no, he wrapped up a pretty big package in that little
Oh
thing.
my gosh, that whole series is profound. I mean, you could meditate on it a very, very long time because there's a lot in there for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, let's continue on here before we get because I know you don't have a
Yep.
whole ton of time.
Yep.
Um, Okay, and since in manifesting itself, it cannot exhaust itself or pass without a trace into the manifestation, it remains always the possibility of being of the sort that is its constant and proper attribute. So this would be the immutability of God, right? That it doesn't, it's not swallowed up. Like there's this quote. There's a quote that I put in here from this dialogue here. The absolute substance, which has no proper name, presents itself as one, manifesting itself as an indestructible unity through the production of its opposite. Just as true unity, positive unity, does not fear multiplicity and does not flee from it, but on the contrary, produces it within itself, and in producing it is not swallowed up by it. Rather, it remains that which it is. It remains a unity, and by that proves clearly that it is essential unity, unity by its very nature, and consequently cannot be destroyed by any multiplicity. But what's interesting for me here is that it produces the multiplicity within itself, and in producing it is not swallowed up by it.
Yeah.
So this is the immutability of God, like the unchanging nature of the essence, this unity, right? Okay.
Yeah, but it's never, but even that unchanging essence, because we've talked about this before too, that's kind of because that's divine simplicity, right? The unchangingness of God. Like God is simple without parts.
Right.
But yet again, that's the monad. Like you wouldn't that doesn't even exist. So like this in its expression, in its multiplicity, in its, I mean, within Christian theology, you'd say creation, but also distinct from creation, because that would be the co-eternal relationship of God, which isn't even really prior to creation. It's just like in the liturgy, when we talk about like pre-eternal, like what's that? Like what the hell is pre-eternal?
Right.
You know? So like that's always present. The multiplicity is always present, but it doesn't exhaust the, I don't know, what does she call it?
It doesn't exhaust. It doesn't.
The substance.
It's not swallowed up by it.
Swallowed up. Yeah.
I like that. I like that phraseology there.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yep.
so then he goes on. We're going to get to the beyond being part here.
Okay.
The absolute principle defines itself as that which has the possibility of being. There's a sentence. And as that which has power is superior to that over which it has the power, which Origen talks about when it comes to the relationship between the Father and the Son, right? There's like he says to, when he talk, because we think in terms of greater than, and there is no greater than, right? So he says you have to be careful when you think about this. You have to be careful you don't fall into that trap, right? But there is a superior, the Father is superior to the Son because he is almighty. And now I want to get this right. If he is almighty, then he has something to be almighty over. Like, so there's this, and you can't think about it in time, right? So that's what makes it so difficult, because you want to say one came before the other, but it didn't. Okay, let me just keep reading.
Yeah.
And as that which has power is superior to that over which it has the power, we must say that the absolute principle is superior to being, that it is above being, that it is super ens, super real, beyond being. It is clear analytically that the absolute principle is in itself singular and simple, because plurality supposes relation. This unity and absolute simplicity is the primary definition of the absolute principle as it became known in the East. And since religious man always wants to become like his God and thus to unite with him, the constant aspiration of Oriental religion was to force man to abstract from all plurality, from all forms, and thus from all being. But the absolute principle is the principle of all being. Unity is the principle of all plurality. Simplicity is the principle of complexity, and purity of form produces them all. It is the one and all. Thus, those who want to know it only as one, in its unity alone, know only half of it. and their religion, both theoretically and practically, remains imperfect and powerless. This is the general character of the East. In the opposite way, the Western tendency is to sacrifice absolute and substantial unity for the multiplicity of form and individual characters, so that the West cannot even comprehend unity as more than a purely external order. This is the characteristic of their church, of their state, and their society. The universal religion is called to unite these two tendencies in their truth, to know and realize the true. And then he has a Greek word, which I think is one and all. Yeah, it's one and all. So, and then in the margin, he wrote he wanted to develop this idea, the relativity of all being. Knowledge is relative only because being itself is relative, and not accidentally as the positivists believe, but necessarily by its very nature. The absolute, which is above knowledge, is also above being. So he just talks about relational ontology there, right?
And relative knowing, which is like that's my favorite Jedediah quote that I always remember all the time, is that all knowledge is relative, because it has to be, because that's what he's talking about, but that doesn't mean it's arbitrary, which is where I would like push back on kind of the ahistoric postmodernists that want to like say they like just want to be able to do and go anywhere, and it's like, well, you can't like untether that from your physical body or history or all the other contextual embeddedness that is part of who you are.
Yeah, like Nate said recently, there are rules to relationships, right?
Yes. And those rules, again, even the rules in and of themselves are not hard, fast rules, because they contain their, because the whole point of all this is the rule contains the non-rule.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, and that's, I think that's where intention plays the most important role, right? Like, you can break the rules, you know, aka Job, right? You can break the rules depending, like breaking the, well, I don't know if he's still listening, but I always wonder about this when it comes to David eating the showbread in the temple, right? Like that was a big no-no, right? But but there's an intention there, right? And this is why I often say God is the judge. Like God has to be the one to judge, because he judges the integrity of one's heart, right? And this is what he saw in Job. He saw his integrity. And so Job was allowed to rail and lament and, you know, request a meeting with God.
The difficulty, one thing I would add to that, because I completely agree with that, with like Job and David, and I think those are great illustrations. And I think about intention all the time, because part of the problem with intention, though, is you can't even know your own intention and integrity through a deliberative process.
No, you don't.
Because that's falling into the same trap.
Totally. And that's why I think the only way to actually get it right is to be facing God. And that's the only way that I can phrase it, because everything else gives you the impression that you actually are doing something. And if you face God, that's all you have to do. And the rest is somewhat, it lays itself out. The rest of your way, right? Lays itself out. So, like if I think about Job, I think of someone who's facing God, right? He wants, and he says it, I want a face-to-face with you. Like he's pleading, he's looking to God. That's the only, he knows that is the only place that his answers are going to come from. You know, he tells his friends, oh, you seemed like an oasis, but you're not, right? You're not giving me any nourishment. I have, you know, I need to talk to somebody who can help me here. Really, is what he's saying. And the same is true in David's life, right? Where everything that he does is it's oriented to God. He's facing God. And so some of the things that he does, you know, other people, you know, couldn't do them because they're not actually facing God, if that makes any sense. Which again has to do with that spiritual freedom that we talked about earlier, right? Where there's no deliberation.
Yeah.
Like, Job's not sitting around, for 5 days wondering whether or not he should have a conversation with God. He just wants one, right? And I don't know about David, whether or not he deliberated about the showbread, but I have the sense that he didn't, if I remember correctly.
I mean, from my recounting of the story, I don't think so.
Yeah.
But I don't think the accounts of David are really written that
I
way,
mean,
where
this
it's
is the
getting
thing
into his
about
inner
David.
psychology.
Yeah, I'd like the thing about David that I love is he always seemed to be in a non-deliberative state. It's like, I'll kill
Mhm.
Goliath, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I'll
Yeah.
dance naked in front of the ark, or whatever, semi-naked,
Right.
or I'll be
Right.
inappropriate. I'll be
Yeah.
inappropriate,
Yeah.
and yeah, and in this he expressed some kind of true spiritual freedom, which is really, really interesting to me.
Which is gonna get outside of all sorts of bounds and categories. I mean, all of that really reminds me of Loris and Holy Fools,
Mhm,
and
mhm,
'cause
mhm.
Loris is all over the place
Oh yeah,
throughout the
yeah.
course of his life and lives many different lives. And I think it's a hard it gets at the nature I think what we're talking about ultimately is faith, and it gets at the nature of faith
Yes.
and what it means to live a life of faith. Because it's gonna blur the lines. Again, your whole aversion to straight lines. It's gonna blur the lines between um, really simple kind of the conservative temperament impulses to just be rule followers. Because the problem with that is like that can the kind of heart that wants to follow rules can be a good thing, but then it can also become this thing that's rooted in fear and actually mistrust. That faith actually becomes non-faith because you're using this. The rule becomes mammon. It becomes a way
Mm.
to manipulate and control God, rooted out of your fear that God is not one to be trusted. But then Abraham and Isaac, break that rule. Sorry, Nate.
Well, see, this is yeah, we could go on a big tangent there. Let's not do that right now. We've
Okay,
got
yeah,
we got 15 minutes.
yeah.
So, do you want to do me the favor of recapping this as if you're talking to a kid in grade 6?
Oh my goodness. Well, so part of the problem is I only ever have the language that I have. I feel like I want to tell just a couple quick stories of my daughter. One of my daughters in particular, who she's the funniest of my children. Sorry, she'll see this someday. All my kids will see this someday. She's the funniest, and and she has all these little sayings, and my wife will write down stuff that I say or stuff that the kids say in these books to
Right,
remember. 'Cause she just says kids say the darndest things, right?
right, right.
And And she's told me one day, she said, and I've probably said this to you, but she said, "Papa, you say these profound but boring things." Or she said, the other day we were talking, and what is the saying? It's kind of like, oh, I said something like, "What came first, the chicken or the egg?" And she's like, "Yeah, I think about that statement, or I've thought about that statement before. What comes first, the chicken or the egg?" And then I thought about, who cares? Ah, she's so funny.
The fruit
Ah.
doesn't fall far from the tree.
Oh, it's hilarious. Because okay, so back to the thing, recounting all this like I'm talking to a sixth grader.
Okay, well, let's
Are,
let's just do it in bullet form. So the
okay,
the 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 idea of negation, of non-being, not being a lack. That's a hard one for me to understand.
well, yeah. It's because I think that the lack is present. I mean, that's the way Rollins likes to talk about it, is the lack is present in everything. Like, that's what he would say. The lack goes all the way down to God. So it's even in like whatever. And I think this is what this whole article is saying, is that whenever you say anything or do anything, it's the opposite is included in it.
Mhm,
You
mhm.
know,
It's not
it,
swallowed
it's
up by it. but not
Yeah.
swallowed up by it. But
Yeah.
what I find really interesting about what Soloviev says here, and I have to think about this a lot now, is that it produces the opposite within itself. Okay? Like, he doesn't just say it's reconciling the opposite, or but it literally, this is his quote. The absolute substance, which has no proper name, presents itself as one, manifesting itself as an indestructible unity through the production of its opposite. Just
Yes.
through unity.
So this is the way that I would almost say that, right? Light. When I say light, what produces immediately, whether or not you're conscious to it, is dark. It's there.
Yeah, okay.
You can't understand light apart from dark. It's automatic. And both are present.
Yeah.
And not in a static way.
Yeah.
They're just both there
My husband
immediately.
actually said this the other day. I was like, he's just at the dinner table, and I think he said it in like one sentence, and I said, my God, I've been thinking about this for years, and you just put that out in one sentence.
Well, and yes,
well, it's logical.
Well, yes, and I think this can be the problem with thinky-talky places and intellectual places a little bit, and you've probably heard me say this before too, is that, like, everyone knows the truth.
Yeah.
I think everybody does. Everybody really knows the truth. And just because you can't consciously, explicitly speak about it, I mean, that's somewhat irrelevant.
Well, I think a lot of it too, Luke, at least for me, it when I read that this unity produces within itself its opposite, the production of its opposite, then there are implications to that, like theological implications, right? Like, that I have not yet seen anyone really decide to tackle.
I mean,
so
are you talking about evil?
I am talking about evil, and this is what I said further on after I posted that. I said, here's my heretical question: is the adversary a manifestation of the opposite? It seems the whole, in brackets, story of creation, right? The whole of creation is contingent on his being a part of it. So, like, if I think about that, I think it produces it within itself, and in producing it is not swallowed up by it. Death, trampling, death, right?
Well, exactly. I think that is to me, that is the big, I don't even know that it's, in Girardian sense, it's things hidden since the foundation of the world. I think that is the revelation of Christ at the fullness of time, is showing that very thing, that, like, the kind of new atheist modernist critique of, like, well, if I were God, I could do it better than this, and I could create this painless world. Well, my retort to that through all of this would be that you fundamentally misunderstand what life is. And I mean, you don't really understand being, and like the most condensed form of that, I think, is kenosis by kenosis, this self-emptying.
This is what I think God's talking about when he says you will have pain through childbirth, right? Because to me, the journey of becoming is there's plenty of symbolic language around the whole concept of birth, right? And so, we are literally, I don't remember where I read that, but someone of substance said something like, we're just infantile, right? We haven't been born yet. Like, this is why Jesus said you have to be born again, right?
Yes.
And that, according to Genesis, involves pain.
I think here's the thing, is it involves death, because again, we can't go so Gnostic with this, because that's the thing, all these Christian sacraments, whether they're baptism or the Eucharist or anything, what you are symbolically representing outside of time and eternity is your death.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and I think and you're living into that. And this is ultimately why whatever, I'll throw out my universalist plug, which again, I'm not saying like everybody has to accept dogmatically, but the reason I'm a universalist at the end of the day is that I believe Christ has unified all of creation through death
Yes.
because we all die.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, that's
And
right.
and in doing that, that is our being born again thing. But you can't even rest in this kind of like um you know, historical, critical, abstracted in your head, like, well, I believe in the resurrection. My response, I say, cool. You know what? You know what that thinky thing that you're thinking in your head? You know what's going to happen to that when you die?
Well, see,
It's going to go away.
that thinky thing in your head is heaven, and it has
Yeah.
to be tethered to the earth, right?
Yeah.
The sensory mechanism that you navigate the world in, you know?
Yes.
And if you think about this symbolically, that relationship is everywhere. This mind-body relationship,
Hmm.
heaven and earth, right? Christ and the Theotokos. It's all the same thing to me.
Yeah.
And
Let me Can I ask you a question before as we
Mm.
close out here? Because
Yeah.
this is something I don't know. I've had it in my consciousness back there somewhere just percolating. And so in the church, right? Like in my church, there's inside the altar, and this is often the case, I think it's supposed to be the case, is that there's the icon of the Theotokos
Mhm.
with Christ. Um, and then in the when you're leaving the church on the opposite end of the church, there's the icon of the Dormition of the
Mhm.
Theotokos,
Mhm.
where Christ, the blue, the heaven,
Yeah.
is holding the Theotokos, the
Right.
diminishment
Mhm.
of the earth. So it's almost like there's this yin yang opposite thing that's going on.
Right.
And so it's almost like it's it's incarnation,
Yeah.
advent, and resurrection. But then
Yes.
the resurrection is almost like what I wonder somewhat is it's like it's a I don't is it a diminishment of the body?
No. No. It's well, I mean, is the Theotokos holding Christ a diminishment of Christ?
Right.
No. Right?
Right.
It is
Yeah.
not. Um, I think what it's talking about is, okay, so the church itself is like the Orthodox Church. When you go inside the building, you have entered into the Apocalypse of St. John. It's
Mhm.
modeled after the Apocalypse, okay? And my priest said to me, every Sunday, something old dies and something new begins, right? Every time you go
Mhm.
in there, it's an apocalypse, right? It's the end of the world,
Yeah.
essentially. And so the imagery would reflect that, I think, in that when you go in, you see the Theotokos with Christ's child, right? And when you leave, you should be seeing the Christ with the Theotokos child, right? You should see
Mhm.
the relationship between heaven and earth, like that it's been bound together. That would be. I haven't given it a whole lot of thought, but
Mhm.
it is the apokatastasis. Actually, it's the apocalypse. That's what that is. It ties it all together, right? The Christ child and the Theotokos child. That is heaven and earth, and it's tying it all together. If that makes
Yeah.
any sense.
I mean, it does, but then I'm wondering if there's significance to the flip, as you're entering and then as you're
It's not a
leaving.
negation. that
No, I don't
it's not
I don't
like one flipping the other. It doesn't negate, like, you know because you see this when you first enter and then you see the thing when you leave, it's not negating anything. It's fulfilling. If you can think about it like that, like filling full, right?
I guess my question is
I have
I'm
to think
wondering
about
if
it
it's
more, to be
I
honest.
wonder if it's doxological, like if it's calling you toward something as you leave, you know?
Well,
I
you know
don't
what
know.
keeps coming to my mind when I think about it is Rudolf Steiner. Like Steiner says this, that the super sensible will come crashing in, or Bach says that in the Apocalypse of St. John, right? Like this is the parousia, is when the super sensible comes crashing in. And so like I said, I haven't given it a whole lot of thought. And I don't even
Mhm.
have a church that I enter and leave in, right? So I'm not like confronted with the images on a regular basis. But that's when I see the Dormition icon, that's what I think of. I think of the Parousia. I think of the super sensible crashing in, right? Because how do I put this? I have to think about it more. I'm going to give it
Is
some
the,
more
is the,
thought.
so is the sensor is the super sensible crashing in, seeing this thing that uh that you've been reading about this morning, that wisdom is saying about the unity in all things, or even like in a Barfieldian way, the final, because this is my inclination. This is what I think. I think that is at least the beginnings of final participation are in seeing what your readings are about. It's
Mhm.
starting to see the
Yeah,
world that way, where you
yeah,
start to see the unity in all things,
right,
and you stop, and because that to me is the beginning of the death of the deliberative will.
right.
Because you stop this either-orism that I've been
Well, to
ranting
be
against
honest with
forever.
you, I don't have a problem with that, right? I
Yeah.
have a problem with this language. That's why I wanted to talk to you about this, because as far as what you're just saying now, I have like I feel like I'm in the Tao, right?
Well, yeah,
I'm
you've
in that
always,
and
but
the human just going and and I'm like,
right.
don't fix anything, don't touch anything, just leave it alone. It's doing
Yeah.
its thing, this is a
Yeah.
process, blah blah blah, right? And so I don't have a problem with that, but I wanted to understand better the whole idea of this lack or this privation in terms that I understand, right?
Yeah.
And
Yes.
but I'm thinking more about that Dormition icon now, and yeah, there's things going through my mind, but I don't want to say them because I'm not even sure.
Hey,
So I'm gonna think about it more though, because
until next time, we can just that can be part 2 of because I might have more time to do conversations going forward of Luke and
cool.
Sherry in a uneducated, unread way
Yeah, no,
stumble
you
through
know,
theology.
it's really great, Luke, because like I told you when I was reading that passage, I was like, this is what Luke's always saying, and I don't get him, and I don't get this, so I need to talk to him to help me understand both of them.
Well, I don't know.
And I also think it's a really good opportunity for you to have this platform in order to make these things known, right? That yeah, I just think it's important that you have this platform to be able to say these things. And that's why I'm asking you to explain them to the lesser mind, the sixth grader, seriously, because because um because what many of us are those lesser minds, right?
It's a good thing. It's a good thing for people to do if they need to do it. And I mean, and I hope it makes sense to people. I don't know. I guess we'll see in the comments. It's kind of, that's the thing I'm always getting. Like, even people that are weird, like that was, it stood out to me when Grimm said that to me once, of just like, Luke, you're one of those people. People always say they don't understand me and I'm weird, and you're that for me.
Yeah.
Just, I have no idea what you're saying. Uh, so.
Yeah.
I
Well,
love this. I love this spot. These are conversations I don't have in my regular life. So
yeah, that's great. Yeah. Okay, well, I'll let you go and get to your day, and thanks for taking the time. And we'll do it again.
Yep. Sounds good. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.